Morning. Welcome to our webinar. My name is Clark Banack. I'm the director of the Alberta Centre for Sustainable Rural Communities, or the ACSRC. This webinar, as you no doubt know, is meant to introduce to you some of the highlights from our recently released public report on cooperatives and rural economic development here in Alberta and beyond. The report itself, I suspect a lot of you, again, already know about it. Maybe you've already downloaded a copy. If you haven't, I really urge you to do so, because my plan today is really to give just a high-level overview of the report. Head to our website, uab.ca/ACSRC. You'll find, to be honest, a lot of information on a lot of different projects we're working on, but you'll also be able to navigate yourself to the report, as well as a couple smaller policy briefs and some blogs that speak to different components of this project. You will also receive a link via email within the next day with a link to the report itself and a link to sign up for our newsletter. Before I get too far, however, I do want to acknowledge that the University of Alberta is located on Treaty 6 territory and respects the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. For those of you who might not be that familiar with us, and you're just kind of tuning in for the first time to one of our projects, we're a research center here at the University of Alberta, whose mission is to harness the research and educational capacity of the U of A in support of rural communities and organizations. And in fact, we're the only university center in the entire province dedicated to academic research and community outreach on issues that are facing rural Alberta communities and organizations. And this work has included different components of rural economic development, social service delivery, economic or environmental sustainability, youth retention, volunteerism, and so much more. So I really would urge you, if any of these topics interest you, to head to our website, sign up for our newsletter, and be able to follow along with the work that we do. Also, just a quick plug of our home base. We are located at the Augustana Campus of the University of Alberta in Camrose. Very much the rural arm of the University of Alberta. We're a small campus, about 1,000 students. Many of them come from rural Alberta. Last stat I saw, we draw students from over 170 different Alberta communities. And the students who come here from all over rural Alberta, get a world-class university education built around small class sizes and a lot of real-world community-based work experience. So, just a quick plug to keep Augustana in mind for the teenagers in your life. Before I get too far into the presentation, just a little bit of housekeeping. We are recording this, so you will be able to access a link to the recording after the fact. No one else is being recorded except for me. So if you're in your pajamas, don't worry about it. We're not inadvertently, throwing you on the internet. At the bottom of your screen, there should be a Q&A button. You can click on that. If you have questions throughout the presentation, you can click on that and enter your question. Only I will see it. It will appear on my screen, no one else's. We do plan to have some time at the end for a Q&A, so don't hesitate to enter any questions that come to mind as they come forward for you. And also just some quick thank yous. The U of A technical team who are supporting the online sharing of this event. Kate McConnell, who is our special initiatives coordinator here at the ACSRC, has been doing a lot of work behind the scenes to set this up. The project itself that I'm going to be reporting on today had many contributors from the Augustana student body. Many very good student researchers contributed to different portions of this work. And then especially to all those people in the co-op world who agreed to share their knowledge with me. None of this would have been possible without them doing that sharing. And to be honest, I'm not sure I'm going to say much that they don't already know. But I think it's really important to kind of try to really broadcast this information to a wider audience. And then finally, the project funder, the Alberta Real Estate Foundation. This is an organization that invests in real estate policy, research practices, and education that strengthen Alberta communities. And they've been a wonderful organization to work with from start to finish on this project. And I suspect their interest in this particular work was related to the fact that the underutilization of commercial spaces in rural communities is a significant concern for their foundation, as it is for most rural communities, and it is for our center. So there was definitely a meshing of interests here that came together that allowed them to fund and us to complete this project. Just a little bit of context before we get into the kind of the meat and potatoes of the presentation. One of the central phrases that people in my field throw around is that of community development. And that can mean a few different things to different people, but to me, it really speaks to a particular approach to economic development that focuses mostly on what local people can do to improve the quality of life or solve particular problems in their own communities. And there are so many external pressures on rural communities that local people can do nothing about, right? We can't really control global markets or the details of free trade agreements. We can't stop technological process or progress or those different factors that drive urbanization. We have little say over what provincial or federal governments do in terms of investing in rural communities. Now, obviously, many things have changed from this time period, but in general, this same lack of agency was what rural Albertans faced over 100 years ago. And one of the most meaningful actions they took, to gain some control and to improve their communities was to form cooperatives, right? To improve things for themselves in their communities, right? Rural Alberta, as basically all of you, I'm sure know, was built on the back of co-ops. And this was because, farmers, for the most part, realized there was no other way to accomplish collective goals than by stepping up and solving them themselves collectively. Fast forward to today, of course, co-ops exist still in Alberta and elsewhere, but there has, of course, been an overall decline in the number of co-ops and, the broader role they play in our society. So much so that many people I know and encounter often assume that co-ops are an old-fashioned idea, right? They don't really fit in today's economy. And this project was really about interrogating that assumption. So more formally, we set out 3 broad goals for this particular project. We wanted to identify actual models of co-ops that were well positioned to generate economic growth, create or retain jobs and services, and support, the commercial and residential real estate market in our real Alberta communities. We wanted to identify the best practices associated with ensuring the success of these co-ops, and we wanted to identify ways by which governments of all 3 levels could best support co-ops that could do these things. To answer these questions, we did a fair bit of work with existing scholarly literature on co-ops in rural spaces, but we also went out and conducted, it's right near 50 now, 50 or just under 50 interviews with various founders and members of successful rural co-ops, with co-op developers who have lots of experience working with co-ops in rural spaces, and with academics who could speak to the broader issues related to co-ops in rural spaces from their own work. And ultimately, we argue that, surely co-ops are not a panacea to, solve all that ails rural communities, but there are definitely local co-ops, definitely local models of co-ops that possess a lot of potential as rural economic development mechanisms. And there's much that governments, again, at all 3 levels can do to support the growth of co-ops in rural spaces. So don't have time to go over all of the details of the report, of course, but I would urge you to download it and go through it. It is a bit of a hefty report, but I think it's worth it. The plan today is really to speak just a little bit to topic 1, identifying those co-op models that do have some potential. Just for lack of time, I'm largely going to skip over topic 2. But then I am going to come back and narrow in on topic 3 and speak at the end about, what all 3 levels of government can do to support cooperative ecosystems in rural communities. But before we get too far, I should very quickly, address what is a co-op. The academic definition of a co-op, it's a bit dry, but as all academic definitions are, I guess, an autonomous association of persons united voluntarily to meet their common economic, social, and cultural needs and aspirations through a jointly owned and democratically controlled enterprise. There's the academic definition. Now, this can take many forms, but in general, we're talking about a business that's commonly owned by the members that generally use its services. And the most common types that we tend to find would be marketing or producer co-ops, user or consumer co-ops, financial or insurance-based co-ops, and employee-owned or worker co-ops. Now, co-ops are often referred to as social economy businesses. And by that, we mean they're essentially hybrid organizations that certainly earn revenue within the marketplace, but they're also often guided by broader social objectives. And I think that's an important part of what a co-op is often. But this description, I think, has also often led to the erroneous belief that co-ops are not real businesses, right? The fact of the matter is, almost all co-ops, including every single one highlighted in this report, do operate within the marketplace like any other business and must operate as a finely tuned operation capable of generating sustainable profits, or they will fail. One final note about co-ops in general before I get into the report. In rural contexts, we knew this before the project, and this project just reaffirmed this idea that they often form when an important service gap exists in a particular community. Something is missing from the community, and that's where a co-op can form and fill that gap. But beyond filling that role, it's really important to kind of just remember, even though this is kind of obvious, but just to kind of bring it to the fore, locally owned co-ops ensure both control of the operation and the profits that are generated from the operation are retained in the community rather than being extracted to distant shareholders. This is something really, really important. I think we have to keep at the fore as we go through this. So the report itself. I mentioned kind of goal 1 was to identify some cooperative models that we think really do have some potential to generate economic growth in rural communities. In the project or in the report, we highlight 3 different types of co-ops, and within each of these discussions, we point to 2 prominent examples of each. So essentially, we do a deep dive on 6 different co-ops. They're all relatively local co-ops, and that actually wasn't the intention at the beginning. We thought at the outset of this project that we would end up highlighting a lot of co-ops from afar that we felt could really fit. And we did come across, a lot of different really intriguing examples. But in the end, the 6 that fit best were already operating here. And, some of them I know for a fact you're going to have heard of them before, but that doesn't mean kind of the lessons that are ready to be learned from these aren't less applicable. And just back to this point of exploring other co-ops or types of co-ops or examples of co-ops beyond these 6. We learned about cooperatively owned pubs in Britain. We learned about municipal road maintenance equipment sharing co-ops in the United States, and a bunch of different ones. And even though we don't write about them, explicitly in the report, a lot of the lessons we learn just from talking to people involved in them are kind of interwoven through the report as we go. Anyway, with that out of the way, the 3 models of co-ops that we focus on. The first, new generation agricultural co-op. Some of you will have heard this term before. It might be new to others of you. A new generation co-op model is essentially, this is something that emerged in kind of the 70s and 80s in the United States. And it's a co-op designed mainly to allow cooperatively owned ag businesses to raise high levels of capital at the outset of their venture. Generally, the idea was to invest in some sort of value-added processing. Generally speaking, a new generation co-op is one that will sell multiple versions of shares. And this is really kind of what differentiates it from other forms of co-ops. You're going to get your basic membership shares that all co-ops would have. There are also often going to be delivery shares required for individual producer to utilize the services of the co-op. But there are also different types of investment shares that allow individuals who will not necessarily be utilizing the services of the co-op to make investments in the business with the hope of eventually acquiring a suitable return on that investment. And this is kind of the key point. This is the type of share that really differentiates it from other co-ops. And it's in place because, again, it's often a requirement of these types of operations to raise a high level of capital at the outset. The two examples we focus on in the report are actually, to be honest, probably the two best known contemporary co-op success stories in rural Alberta already. Again, it would surprise me if you haven't heard of them. But even though they're already relatively well known, we really did feel that there still are some key lessons that could be drawn from a deep dive into each of them, and especially some of the more recent operations. So the two new generation co-ops that we focus on in the report, Westlock Terminals and Battle River Railway, very similar stories actually. Westlock was first by a couple of years, but basically in the first decade of the 2000s, large corporations deemed a piece of key agricultural infrastructure in each community unprofitable and simply planned to shutter them. It wasn't worth it to keep them going. In Westlock, it was a long-serving grain terminal, and in an area east of Camrose, it was a 50-some mile stretch of rail line, short line rail, that served as a key grain transportation route for local farmers. Now, in each case, a group of local farmers realized immediately the very serious negative impacts that these moves were going to have, both in terms of their own operations, their own increased transportation costs they were about to face, but also on the local communities who'd be losing jobs, who'd be losing a source of municipal tax revenue, and even losing that unique form of economic activity that arises when farmers literally travel into these communities to haul their grain. Facing these challenges, and again, these are two very long stories. I get into more detail in the report, but in both communities, locals end up forming new generation ag co-ops. They turn to the community in search of investments from local people and end up being successful in raising that capital required to purchase in Westlock the terminal and east of Camrose the short line railway. And fast forward to today, they're both thriving businesses who generate meaningful economic impacts for local farmers and their broader communities. Now, there are a number of formidable challenges on both projects. They both involved immense amounts of unpaid labor. One of the people involved told me it was like constantly pushing rocks up mountains, right? That's what it was like to start one of these things, to have it get off the ground. And that's not unheard of. That most co-ops we've encountered, tell us similar tales. But they did that work, and they did succeed. And today they're serving their local communities, their meaningful source of employment and tax revenue. And maybe most interestingly to me is they both have really interesting ideas to continue to expand in innovative directions, things that simply would not have been possible if they didn't form that co-op and save this piece of infrastructure. Now, these are unique circumstances. Not many of you, and in the communities you're tuning in from, will have the opportunity to purchase a terminal or a railway. But there's clearly a model here for similar situations, right? Facing the loss of a critical piece of agricultural infrastructure or an ag-based business or any other key employer in your region. There's a model here to potentially save that. But there's also a model, of course, launching something new, right? The second form or second model of co-op that we speak to in the report, maybe a little bit less familiar to some of you, but I know some of you, this will be old hand. Community investment co-ops, or in Alberta, they're often called opportunity development co-ops, or ODCs as a shorthand. These are legally incorporated co-ops that sell memberships to individuals and are collectively governed by a board of directors like any other traditional co-op. However, what differentiates these from other types of co-ops is that the members of the co-op will often, beyond just buying that membership share, will often make an additional monetary investment in the co-op. And the board of the co-op then turns around and invests that capital accumulated through these investments in any other local venture they deem investment worthy, with the intent of both supporting the growth of local businesses, but also providing a return on investment for the membership. Okay, so ultimately these co-ops are intended to act as a community economic development mechanism. And the underlying logic that these types of co-ops are built upon is really two kind of interrelated points. The first is it is becoming more difficult for entrepreneurs in rural communities to access investment capital from traditional banks. Okay, that's a given. We hear that all the time. The second point, the annual contributions that Canadians make to their RSPs, their retirement funds, often represent a really large stream of capital regularly leaving their communities and ending up in the coffers of publicly traded companies, thousands of miles away. What if, supporters of community investment co-ops ask, there was a way to direct even just a tiny fraction of that investment capital from the individual portfolios of rural and small town citizens back into their communities by opening avenues for them to invest directly in local businesses that are finding it increasingly difficult to acquire necessary capital from banks. This notion seems especially intriguing given the large number of small and medium-sized businesses across Canada expected to transition ownership over the next decade. The silver tsunami, this is often referred to. And for rural communities in particular, this coming wave of transition, of business transition, poses a very significant problem, given the difficulty owners in these small communities can have in finding individuals that have access to the capital required to purchase these businesses. Community investment co-ops or opportunity development co-ops are tailor-made for this situation, right? By providing access to capital to local entrepreneurs willing to buy an existing business, the co-op is playing a direct role in retaining jobs and wealth in their community, while simultaneously avoiding yet another underused commercial space. And of course, at the same time, generating a potential profit for those who are making the investment. So there's a lot of wins in a lot of directions, at least in theory, with this model of co-op. Now, the preeminent example of a successful ODC in Alberta is, of course, the Sangudo ODC. Again, I suspect a lot of you would have heard of this. We speak a lot more about what they've accomplished in the report. Incorporated in 2009, they successfully raised the capital required first to support the purchase of the local butcher shop, which was in danger of closing for good. Instead, a pair of young local entrepreneurs were able to purchase it with the help of the co-op and keep it going. It's still going strong today. They were able to purchase a hall and repurpose it as a restaurant and gathering place in the community. And they even got into real estate development, buying property and building a new house that they eventually sold to a young family. And again, this wasn't charitable activity. Of course, the members of this co-op were interested in these types of investments because there was a community benefit involved, right? But they were able to do this while turning a profit, while gaining a return on their investment. The report also highlights, a few other uses of the model in rural Alberta. The most recent being the formation of the Vermilion Opportunity Development Co-op, which managed to raise the capital required to build a new storefront and adjoining workspace to lure an artisan cheesemaker into their commercial sector. Now, these success stories aside, to be honest, the overall record of ODCs in Alberta is decidedly mixed. Okay, and we didn't want to shy away from those realities in this report, and we spend quite a bit of time, I think, discussing, the very real challenges that exist for this concept. Honestly, one of the key roadblocks is simply a lack of awareness of the model in rural areas, both on the part of community leaders who might be in a position to want to do something for their community and could potentially take the lead in forming an ODC, but they simply just don't know about this concept, But the broader citizenry who is going to be asked to invest in this co-op, if they don't understand the model, they haven't heard of the model, it's a little bit confusing. They're not going to be eager to invest their own cash in this as well. But the lack of awareness problem exists for municipal officials, economic development officers, and councillors too, who could potentially be in the position to champion this model in this rural community. And I'm going to talk a little bit more toward the end about what municipalities in particular can do with this. But just to take a quick step back, I'm certainly not suggesting that the model is suited for every circumstance, but ensuring the model is at least on the table or part of the idea soup, as it's sometimes called, when a challenge arises in a community is really key. And a second thing that we talk about in the report is the importance of having co-op developers to support those interested in embracing this model and incorporating an ODC. The trials and tribulations of incorporating and seeking local investors are actually somewhat horrific. I wish they weren't so, and I'm going to kind of speak to that in a little bit more detail shortly as well. But to have co-op developers or more co-op developers be able to guide people through that process, I think would be a big help. And those aren't the only pieces required in the puzzle. Again, there's more details in the report. But again, I will say, I do personally see a lot of potential here for community investment co-ops to support young entrepreneurs to take over existing businesses, or for those who are thinking about new ventures in rural communities. And even here, as a professor at the Augustana campus, I mentioned we have a lot of rural students here. I know so many rural students who come here because it's really important for them to attain a university degree, but they also really want to find a way to make it back to their rural community somehow in their career. And we don't make it that easy. There aren't a lot of options depending on what they study. And just more broadly, I think that's a conundrum that we have to think a little bit more carefully about, how we connect people who come from rural, who want to be back in rural. How do we make that connection and help that transition forward? I think that's key for rural communities. And of course, there's a lot of different ways we can be doing that. But opportunity development co-ops are just one more way that we can think about being able to support young people who want to come back and make an investment in a community by purchasing an existing business or starting something new, some sort of cutting edge business that they think can work in rural communities, small footprint agriculture, things like that. There's a lot of opportunity here, a lot of potential. And then, we hear a lot about housing and housing stock in rural communities, the lack of seniors housing. These are issues too that could potentially be addressed at least somewhat through these opportunity development co-ops or community investment co-ops. So again, a lot of potential here, a lot of untapped potential. The third form of, or third model of co-op that we talk about in our case study, renewable energy co-ops. I'll be a little bit quicker here. The transition to renewable is here already. However you feel about that, it's here, it's happening. And one of the central questions I think we all need to really be asking ourselves is, who is ultimately going to benefit from this transition? Who's going to own and control and profit from the energy generating infrastructure that sits at the heart of this transition? And here again, the co-op model presents a really intriguing pathway with respect to retaining control and profits locally. And in this report, we highlight two very different examples of how the co-op model can be used to ensure this local benefit for rural communities. There is one key similarity between them, and that is they're both essentially community investment co-ops. They turn to their community to find local investors, and they use that capital then to finance their infrastructure projects. But the type of infrastructure they're building is quite different. The first one we talk about, Peace Energy Cooperative, which is actually in Dawson, British Columbia, based out of Dawson. Really interesting cooperative that has actually been around some time now. They're actually rather mature and have achieved some, and are on the verge of achieving some really, really great things. They played a central role in British Columbia's first commercial wind farm, capable of powering roughly 35,000 homes. They've done a lot of other smaller projects. They have essentially a solar installation worker co-op on the go. But I think most excitingly, they're very, very close toward a cooperatively owned 5 megawatt solar farm comprised of roughly 12,000 solar panels on land located near Peace River. And not only have these projects created local jobs and tax revenue and green energy, they're also going to ensure that profits generated from this green energy generation remain largely in the community. The second co-op that we explore in our case study under the renewable energy co-op model, Bow Valley Green Energy, a very different form of renewable energy co-op, a much younger version of a co-op compared to Peace Energy, but what they've accomplished in the short time of their existence is actually pretty impressive. So they're, again, investing in solar energy installations with an eye on retaining profits for local investors. But they've embraced a very different model. They are not building large wind or solar farms like Peace Energy did. Rather, they've embraced what's often called a behind-the-meter microgeneration model. And this involves multiple small-scale solar installations across several commercial sites from which they sell power to the building owner through a power purchase agreement. Again, I'm not going to get into all the intricate details here, but essentially this guarantees the owner of the building price stability for their electricity, and it offers, of course, the co-op access to revenues to both finance their next installation and return profits to their investors. Again, in the report, a lot more details, especially about both the legitimate opportunities and the very real challenges these models face, right? Again, I'm not trying to sugarcoat the fact that there are challenges. These things are hard to do. But clearly, I think, especially, these two examples offer excellent windows into how a co-op model, again, often deemed old-fashioned, right, can clearly be used in very new and innovative ways in rural spaces. So overall, all 6 of these co-ops that I mentioned briefly have successfully ensured that more money is retained within their communities. They've increased local employment. They've created avenues for local skill upgrading in areas like management, accounting, negotiation, leadership, and they've built social capital among members, among the community. And this is, researchers have long noted, having those strong social capital networks strongly contributes to community self-reliance and resilience, okay? And, we're certainly not meaning to suggest that, if you replicate these models, the economic prospects of any rural community is going to be wholly revived. Of course, that's not the message. But there are positive things associated with these co-ops that I think are really clear from this presentation, but also from the report itself. Beyond just highlighting these case studies, it was really important for us to try to glean some information from elsewhere. What could we gain in terms of learning from other regions who actually have robust cooperative sectors compared to what we have here today? And there are lots of different areas in the world that have robust cooperative sectors, but we actually settled on Wisconsin as a kind of a model to learn from. There are a lot of similarities between Wisconsin and Alberta, actually. Like Alberta, rural Wisconsin was largely built on an impressive network of co-ops, mostly ag-based. Today, we both continue to have vibrant ag sectors with, slightly different focuses. And even, on a completely different level, we're similar in the sense that, both Alberta and Wisconsin have a couple of very large cities that tend to lean progressive in their politics, and a large rural region that, leans much more conservative. Yet, unlike Alberta, rural Wisconsin continues to be home to an incredibly robust cooperative ecosystem. Okay, there are several large ag co-ops that have been around for many decades that continue to perform exceedingly well. The last statistic I saw, there are like 6,000 or more people directly employed by ag co-ops or ag service co-ops. But the cooperative ecosystem isn't made up just of kind of old legacy co-ops. Wisconsin also led all American states, every single American state, in the number of rural-based co-ops incorporated between 2011 and 2019. So new ones are continuing to form as well. So why? What's going on here that we can learn from? And I was lucky enough to spend a week in rural Wisconsin, talking to as many people as I could from there that were active in their cooperative ecosystem, trying to understand. And I just threw up a quote here from someone. The co-op model is embedded in our culture, right? We have all of these different ways that we use it. There's a high level of knowledge about cooperatives across the state, which of course is the key piece of the puzzle. If that awareness is not there, the co-ops wouldn't be nearly as active, and new ones certainly wouldn't be forming. But beyond that, I think it's important to highlight that, especially the large ag-based and rural electric co-ops, that they continue to thrive helps that level of awareness. But beyond that, there's actually a really impressive cooperative lobby in the state of Wisconsin, who have been, by and large, been very, very successful in achieving a very pro-co-op legislative environment in the state, something that makes it far easier for new co-ops to form, and the momentum starts rolling from there. But what can we really learn from Wisconsin, given what I've just said, right? We don't have that mass of large ag co-ops to kind of push this agenda forward, to be that large lobbying voice. So what's the point of paying attention to Wisconsin? The broader lesson I learned from Wisconsin, and the real reason I incorporated this into the report, is because probably the key lesson I actually learned wasn't about their cooperative lobby, although this is related to the success of the cooperative lobby, but rather what I've described in the report as the cross-aisle support that cooperatives receive at the state level. I don't know if you've noticed, politics in the United States is polarized, right? Maybe more polarized than it's been in, since the Civil War, maybe. I don't mean to be super dramatic. But anyway, back to Wisconsin. Wisconsin's not immune to this. There are persistent and heated political battles between progressives and conservatives on pretty much everything, except co-ops. Support for the co-op model is basically the only thing they agree on, and this support is strong. The state has passed numerous pieces of legislation designed to support and nurture the co-op sector. Some of this is financial support for co-op development, but a lot of it is simply working with co-ops to ensure existing regulations around business practices and investment rules do not inadvertently stymie cooperatives or co-op growth. Okay, so and I was super intrigued by this cross-aisle support when I was down there talking to people, right? And especially so, I'm from rural Alberta. I've been doing all this work in rural Alberta around cooperatives, talking to a lot of people, and time after time, I ran into this notion that, well, co-ops, that's a left-wing idea, right? So, and I'm not really left-wing, so it doesn't fit. And to be frank, successive conservative provincial governments here, all heavily dependent on votes from rural Alberta, really haven't expressed at least a lot of outright support for co-ops that I've seen. Now, one of the most memorable conversations I had over the course of this entire research project was with a state politician from rural Wisconsin who had recently taken the lead on successfully having a bill passed in the Wisconsin State Assembly, or whatever it's called, in support of a lot of state money for feasibility studies for those who are interested in starting cooperatives. So, a really important part of cooperative development. But what was most interesting was this was a very conservative-leaning Republican politician, and he made no bones about his many conservative opinions on many different things that we were talking about while we were having coffee. And I mentioned to him that it was really new to me personally to see a conservative politician advocating so strongly for co-ops. And he was actually a bit flabbergasted by this. And he responded, and I'm paraphrasing slightly, but he basically said, is it just a learning thing in Alberta? Do they not see the connection between rural co-ops and rural business growth, between rural economic development? Because it's clear as day to me. And this, summed up one of the most important differences for me between Wisconsin and Alberta in terms of contemporary political support. In Wisconsin, the concept is understood by left and right politicians alike to be one that can be a pillar for positive economic growth. I think that's hugely, hugely important. And with that, I'll kind of just transition to the last part of my presentation, which is, okay, maybe we can garner, this political support from across the aisle, like they do in Wisconsin. What is that actually going to mean? How can governments at all levels actually support a cooperative ecosystem that in turn could really be a boon for rural economic development in Alberta? I basically in the report narrow in on two broad arguments. Again, I'm not going to get deep into the details here. There are more details, of course, in the report. And of course, the devil will always be in the details when it comes to this kind of stuff. Most co-op experts will point to very technical points in legislation, in regulations, in tax codes that can be tweaked to either support or stymie co-op growth. And I heard in the course of this project very many specific examples of existing legislation or regulations that inadvertently can stymie co-op development. So how do we ensure that's not happening? The most effective way, to be honest, is to have an institutionalized entity within government, within a department that understands and can work directly with co-ops, or at least organizations that represent co-ops here in Alberta. That might sound a little far-fetched, but most provincial governments at one time or another actually possessed this level of expertise within their ag industry or within their rural development ministries. A person who was strongly connected to co-ops, who knew how to support or or alternatively how to stymie their growth. But by and large, these types of people, this type of expertise has been phased out. There are a few exceptions. Quebec and Manitoba and maybe a little bit in Atlantic Canada still do a little bit of this, but a lot of provinces don't. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the Quebecs and the Manitobas and the Atlantic Canadas have more robust cooperative sectors because of this expertise within government and this willingness to work directly with co-ops to ensure policy is supportive and not a deterrent for co-ops and cooperative development. Now I know there are folks from different municipalities in the audience, quite a few of you. You obviously have far fewer policy mechanisms at your disposal here. But basically, in every case that we explored in the study, the support of the municipality was actually deemed crucial. And the support these co-ops received ranged from direct investments or grants, but also just to an openness to work with the co-op around zoning or bylaw concerns, or simply just to be aware of the model and being a cheerleader for the project. All of those things can help. And I'll say just a little bit more about that in a second. But one last thing around supportive policy environment. And again, without trying to get too far down into the weeds, it is important to note that in 2018, the Alberta government did establish a 30% tax credit for those who invest in a community investment co-op. Okay, a really nice incentive that could help all of these different co-ops that we're talking about, garner more local capital to do the work, the important work that they are doing. But this tax credit that did exist was on the books for a very short time. That the ink wasn't even dry. 2019, upon winning power, the UCP quickly cuts this tax credit. I don't personally know the details of why the cut was made. More than one person told me they don't necessarily think the UCP was 100% aware of the potential this policy could actually have for co-ops or rural economic development. It was more just kind of a, we're just getting rid of, stuff that the old government did, that happens whenever there's a government transition. But working to reestablish this type of credit, which is similar to ones that exist in many other provinces in Canada. This isn't some anomaly. Most other provinces actually, or many other provinces have this type of tax credit. This is a policy decision that we strongly recommend, strongly support in this report. The second and last way in which governments can really work to support cooperative ecosystems is by directly supporting cooperative development work. The most common message we heard throughout this project was launching a co-op is very hard work, okay? But the second most common thing that we heard in this project was this co-op would not have been possible without the help of a co-op development expert. And indeed, because that launching of co-ops can be so hard is exactly why co-op developers are so important. Now, I mentioned this notion co-op development or co-op developers many times through the presentation. I haven't actually kind of paused to kind of explain what I'm talking about. These are the professionals whose role is to guide, facilitate, advise new and developing co-ops. They're people who have technical knowledge necessary to navigate the various legal regulations that co-ops encounter. But they're also the people who can provide advice on questions around collective board governance or business strategy, etc. Right? These people are indispensable to co-ops getting off the ground and succeeding. A good co-op developer will even be able to tell you if forming a co-op is actually a bad idea in certain cases, because it's not always the answer. In every single case we examined for this report, the help and advice from co-op developers was crucial. And similarly, in basically every case we examined, all of the co-ops that we talked to, at least in their initial stages, were not in a position to afford to pay, full freight for the services that co-op developers could provide. So this is one area where some external funding is necessary to boost the rural cooperative ecosystem. One significant source of funding necessary for co-op developers comes directly from the co-op sector itself. The most prominent example being the Federated Cooperatives Limited support for an organization called Cooperatives First, which is based in Saskatoon, but has a very successful track record of launching co-ops across rural Western Canada. Traditionally, federal and provincial governments of all stripes have also set aside funds for this purpose. Unfortunately, this funding has largely declined or been cut outright. Reinvesting in co-op development, especially co-op development focused on rural communities, is a policy choice by both levels of government that we support unequivocally. Municipalities, again, possess far fewer resources than the federal and provincial governments, right, in this regard. No one's expecting you to come up with, pockets of money to be able to support this. You have your own struggles where your cash is needed. But equipping economic development officers who are employed by municipalities across rural Alberta with some knowledge about co-ops in general and some basic advice on how to support those in the community interested in starting one would be a very positive development. And this could very well be a role a group like the Economic Developers of Alberta plays, right? Ensuring that this type of training is more commonplace among ECDev officers throughout rural Alberta. We make a few other recommendations around, the importance of supporting cooperative education to raise awareness of the model, the importance of supporting research and education around co-ops and rural economic development at the university level. But I'll wrap up my comments today by simply stating that, at the end of the day, local people are often best equipped to address the unique concerns or seek to meet the particular needs of specific rural communities. But these community-led solutions, cooperatives being one of the most prime examples of a community-led solution, are things that require a certain commitment of support from governments. In the same way, community-delivered social services obviously need some support from governments. And as the Wisconsin case exemplified so well, this ought not to be a partisan issue. There are good reasons for politicians of all stripes who care about rural communities to support rural cooperative ecosystems. And I will leave it there. Quickly, though, I will flash up our contact information. So again, there's our website. If you're eager to get the final report now, again, it's going to be emailed to you within the next 24 hours, but you can find it there. But you can also sign up for our newsletter. There's a bunch of contact information to follow us. But the last thing I do want to stress, a number of you might be sitting there. I'm hoping a number of you are sitting there, hopeful, engaged, motivated. Why aren't we starting this type of co-op in our community? I just want to stress that I'm a professor. I am not a co-op developer. I'm not an expert in the technical details and all of the different things you have to consider when you launch a co-op. That is what cooperative developers do. And I just wanted to shine the light on a couple organizations that could potentially help you. So if this is you thinking about where I could go next, I mentioned already Cooperatives First. a group based out of Saskatoon, but they work across Western Canada, do very, very good work supporting groups that want to do this. And then we have our own right here in Alberta, the Alberta Community Cooperative Association that can do similar work. So if that's you and you're thinking about, moving steps in that direction, these are the folks that you want to contact, and they can help you in next stages. So with that, I'm going to end my slideshow, and we can see if there are any questions. So we have about 10 minutes, maybe a little bit less. Let me make sure I can stop sharing here. So I think I've stopped sharing my screen. Let's see if I can make do with. Okay, so I'm kind of on my own here, so I'm skimming through very quickly. One of the first questions: how can this model of cooperative rural economic development keep young adults in small towns and communities? Can it create career opportunities or post-secondary opportunities in rural communities that attract youths to big urban centers? Really good question. And again, maybe this came in a little bit before I spoke about community investment co-ops and my own belief, my own experience with, rural kids who end up at Augustana, get a university degree, and want to find a way back home. And of course, there are some ways. Some go on to law school, some become nurses or teachers, and then kind of trickle back home. But for those who might be interested in, starting a business or taking over an existing business when, someone's retiring and wants to cash out, I really think a cooperative, a community investment co-op, having one of those established in your community that can raise capital and support and invest in ventures like that, I think could be a really good idea. Where would I find a municipal co-op for sharing of equipment? Okay, so this, I wish we spent a little bit more time in the report talking about this, because this one, I knew there would be interest in the among municipalities here. This was something that did exist for like a period of 10 years, somewhere in the American Midwest. The exact details are escaping me now. I need to, if you gave me 3 minutes, I could rifle through my papers behind me and give you the answer, but I don't want to do that to the audience. But if you're the one who asked me that question or are just interested, track us down at ACSRC and send me an email, and I'd be happy to share that information with you, because it doesn't actually exist anymore. It ran into, like so many things with municipalities, even this cost sharing agreement that did over a number of years save municipalities a lot of money. It ended up being axed after 10 or 15 rather successful years because someone decided they could do it even cheaper a different way or whatever. But it did exist for 10 or 15 years and had really good results. And it is something I think would be worth and anticipating here. Okay, just skimming through here. Oh, so someone is just asking, as an economic development officer, have you, we're often encouraged to reach out to cooperatives first, who will support work like this. And they're asking me, has our group engaged with these groups, with cooperatives first? Yes, extensively. I've made friends with a lot of people at cooperatives first. They've been super helpful around this project, connecting me to different people. And I couldn't speak more highly of them. And just to kind of connect this, someone else asks, during your research, did you find instances of First Nations operated co-ops? How could government support these co-ops? So yes, there are Indigenous co-ops out there, a number of really good examples, especially I think even more so maybe in Saskatchewan and Manitoba than Alberta. But the reason I bring this up in relation to my last comments, Cooperatives First works directly with Indigenous communities and has on a number of different co-ops and had them launched. So again, if this is an area that's super interesting to you, contact co-ops first, or even just go to their website and sift around on their website. And I suspect you'd find some information on Indigenous co-ops that are in existence that they've helped. Let's see. Is there a program in Canada to educate on the co-op models? So yes, there are education programs, and it's going to sound like I'm being paid off by bringing them up again, but Cooperatives First actually has training sessions, video recordings, and they host, live online sessions, training sessions. There are other organizations as well. If you actually just start Googling around, there's kind of a Canada-based network where you can gain some knowledge about the co-op model and the intricacies of it. And again, for you economic development officers out there, push economic developers of Alberta. I've had conversations with them. This is not new. They know about co-ops. They do bring in a lot of speakers to their annual events around co-ops, but push them even harder to see if there are ways to bring more of that training to economic development officers that are working across Alberta. And someone actually just mentioned, Cape Breton University has courses on co-ops. Let's see, is there one other question that I can take before we wrap things up? Some of these are just comments. Oh, this could be a loaded one. How can the provincial government enable municipal governments to have more control to support co-ops in their community? As many of you know, right now, the provincial government isn't terribly interested in enabling municipal governments to have more control of anything. Just kidding. Maybe that was a joke too far. That's a tough question because there are jurisdictional issues. But again, I would say that the best thing that provincial governments could do at this level would be to, with economic developers of Alberta, support some training for economic development officers who work at municipalities to be able to provide some support for those who want to engage with the co-op model. And I think I've pretty much come to the end of the questions. Most of the things I'm seeing are comments. So with that, this one last question that did just pop up, and I know the person who's asking and why he's asking this. In your research, did you get a sense of the level of awareness of the cooperative model amongst locals in rural communities? And I know this is top of mind because this person does research with cooperatives across Canada and consistently finds that one of their chief complaints is lack of awareness of the co-op model. People I talk to in rural are aware of the co-op model to some extent, but my sense is, if I had to say kind of the average answer is, they know what a co-op is because they know the UFA is in town, or some of them are still part of an REA. But not many of them think about co-ops in terms of a potential solution to contemporary problems they are facing. That's where the lack of connection is, or the lack of awareness. They know what a co-op is, but very few people are thinking about the model as a potential tool to use on a contemporary problem in the way that all of these different co-ops that I talked about in the project did. And that's really what this is about, is trying to build awareness. This isn't just an old-fashioned idea. It's just not buying fence posts at the UFA. It's just not trying to hold on to your REA or selling it, if that's what you decide to do, to Fortis or whoever. It's about trying to think about ways to use this model, again, to start new co-ops in ways that support rural communities. And I think that's a good place to end. Thank you so much to everybody who tuned in. We had a record audience today. And stay tuned for other things we're going to be doing. Follow us, sign up for our newsletter, get in touch with us if you have questions or comments. And with that, I wish you all a great afternoon. Take care. Goodbye, everybody.